Before we begin today's episode, I want to take a moment to address an urgent matter. Over the coming weeks, we're going to be focusing more on the bad therapy that happens within family court systems, a space where silence is often enforced through gag orders, preventing survivors from speaking out about the injustices they faced. You may already be familiar with the name Rachel Pickrell Hawkins. She has recently made headlines as a protective mother who was sentenced to serving jail time. Her crime was refusing to send her children to therapy sessions intended to reunify her children with their father, a man who is accused of sexual, physical, and emotional violence. I've had the pleasure of speaking to Rachel, and I look forward to having her on our show. But it is thanks to the interventions of Rachel Siegel from Fortitude and Flourish that Rachel's case gained national attention, and her release was secured without a gag order. However, Erin herself is now at risk of being silenced by the courts through a gag order, as she fights to remove parenting restrictions and ensure her child's safety. These gag orders are a powerful tool used to keep mothers and children from exposing injustices that are happening inside of the family court system around the country. Erin and Rachel's stories, they're not isolated cases. This is happening to countless other mothers. If you'd like to support Erin's legal fight and help protect other survivors from being silenced, you can find the GoFundMe link in our show notes. You can also search the title, Help Protect Voices for Families and Children, and donate there. Your support can make a real difference. And now, without further delay, let's get into today's episode. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. This week, we're continuing the story of Rose, whose therapist, Chrissy, perpetuated an intense affair with Rose's husband, Scott. There's a whole lot of other moving parts to this story, so if you haven't listened to the last episode, I hope you'll go back and start there. When we left off, Rose was still mostly in the dark about whatever was happening between her husband and Chrissy, whom she had been working with for almost a decade. Chrissy and Scott's so-called friendship, it had started with long conversations and flirty texting, but it was escalating quickly. Now they were sexting and even writing erotic stories for each other. Rose didn't know all of the details, and she certainly didn't know how bad Scott's addiction to ketamine had gotten. She'd seen enough to become increasingly alarmed, but whenever she brought up her concerns with Scott, he would dismiss and gaslight her, spinning the truth and omitting details in hopes of placating her. And when she tried to talk about it with Chrissy, the response was a barrage of well-practiced and ruthless manipulations. The professional part of Rose and Chrissy's relationship was about to change, because finally, after 9 years, Rose's time on that couch was coming to an end. But just like with any previous change in their work together, this could only happen on Chrissy's terms.
My last appointment with her was at the very end of November, right after Thanksgiving. And she was crying the whole time, just on and off crying. And I couldn't figure out why. And the whole time, all we're talking about is her friendship with my husband. She's like, I think we need to end our therapeutic relationship, but I would like for the three of us to be friends. And that's the way she always put it. I would like for the three of us to be able to be friends. I just think you're both amazing people, and I just love you both so much. And I think we need to end this so that we can all three be friends. And this is the same thing my husband's telling me at home. Yeah, I think you should end it. You've been saying it's not therapeutic for a while. Let's all be friends. She's amazing. You're going to have so much fun hanging out together. So this is what I'm getting from both sides. this very kind of coercive, we have to do this. This is the thing to do because he can't quit her. She can't quit him. They connected so well that they can't imagine not being friends. At that point, I'm like, yeah, I guess we can try that. But let's take it slow. Let's take it gently. Let's make sure that we're being careful because this is weird and this is against ethical guidelines and this is not something we should do.
I've said before that unethical termination is one of the most devastating forms of therapy harm. But this is really a whole different level. The therapist sobbing on the couch, begging her client to still like her. Please don't hate me. Can we still be friends? I just love your husband so much. I think we should all be friends. What was Rose even supposed to say? Chrissy was giving her the illusion of choice, pretending that she had any kind of say in how Chrissy conducted herself with Scott. But Chrissy's emotional display stripped away any real semblance of agency. What else was Rose supposed to do when sitting across from this weeping woman that she had known, trusted, and leaned on for 9 years, except to acquiesce? So Rose tried to reassure herself. Maybe I do have the capacity for this. We're all grown-ups. Maybe we can start communicating better and figure out how to navigate this. But it was very quickly obvious that this would not be possible.
There were so many little things that were really awful. And she would send me texts, oh, what do you think about going and seeing this show together? But of course, she's asking at a time when she already knows I'm working, right? All of the things she asked me to do were things that she knew I couldn't do. So they're acting like they're trying to include me in this friendship. But I was never invited to something that happened when I wasn't working, even when my husband was going to things that were happening when I wasn't working. And it was stuff like, oh, well, we didn't think you would like that activity.
And Rose's intuition wasn't off. Most of us know what it feels like to be unintentionally, on purpose excluded. But it's only later that Scott confirms the suspicion.
These lies of omission felt safe to me. We would go to a meditative drumming circle every other week. And before and after it, we would sit in our cars and just talk innocently, even after the kind of sexting had started. And one night we kissed. It really messed me up. The guilt was horrific. I didn't talk to her for a week or two afterwards. I was just riddled with guilt, but I knew how uncomfortable and how upset my wife was that I just had a friend. And she believed that this was non-romantic. It was just a friend. And it made her so upset that this woman was involved in my life the way she was. If she's upset about that, she's going to explode. My marriage will be over if she finds out about this. And so again, it was just stepping over another one of those lines. And the kissing just kind of evolved. Well, I already stepped over that line. I already did this. I'm already guilty of this. What is continuing kissing isn't another fault. Again, the way we rationalize these things. Kissing led to me turning off the GPS on my phone, hanging out at her house, and eventually led to sex, which just shattered me in every possible way. I don't know why exactly that was the line, but I felt like that was the last line. That was the last line of like, at least I didn't do this. The one person I needed to talk to was my wife, and I had lost the ability to talk to her. And so the only person I really had was Chrissy.
After each new transgression, each new line crossed, Scott would be racked with guilt, tormented by what he was doing to his wife. But Chrissy would never let him dwell on that shame for too long. She scrambled to keep him close and to make sure that it was her voice that was the loudest in his head.
She was the only person I could talk to, and she worked so hard to try to justify, try to allow me to see that my needs are important and my wants are important and that this is okay and that polyamorous relationships are amazing and if my wife just understood. And she was the only voice in my head. And to my relief, it was an excusing voice. It was a voice that said, what you're doing is not awful. What you're doing is not terrible. What you're doing is beautiful and based in love.
That's the part to me that escalates this story well beyond just another unfaithful spouse. Affairs are a dime a dozen, but this was an affair with an insightful, calculating therapist who was clearly in control here. Chrissy knew all of Rose's secrets, all of Scott's weak points. She knew Rose was overworked and busy all of the time. She knew Scott was an addict who loved flirting and being flattered. And most of all, she knew exactly how to manipulate their relationship to meet her own needs. It is no exaggeration to say that her behavior was absolutely predatory. It was December now, a month after Chrissy had terminated therapy with Rose. Rose's graduation ceremony was that month, plus the holidays and 2 of her kids' birthdays. It should have been a joyful time, but it was far from it. Her work was wearing her down, and even though she didn't know the full extent of what was going on with her husband, she knew things were not okay, and this wasn't sustainable. And Scott was miserable too. He and Chrissy didn't talk much about theology or philosophy those days, and there wasn't much flirty banter anymore either. Now all of their conversations were mostly him saying, "We can't keep doing this. This has to stop," and her continuing to justify the relationship and insist they stay together. But he says it did help to start to remove his rose-tinted glasses. Chrissy was no longer just the smart, spiritual woman he had fallen for. She was beginning to seem petty and vindictive. Her manipulation had been subtle at first, just a steady current he could choose not to notice. But now he was drowning in it. Finally, toward the end of that year, Scott convinced himself that he needed to come clean to his wife. But he kept finding reasons to postpone the conversation. Meanwhile, he still brought his daughter to therapy every week. And every week, Chrissy would be there waiting for him. During those hours, Scott says he spent about 48 minutes trying to fight her off. And then he'd give in the last 12 minutes. And he'd be left in the wretched state of mind he'd started with, thoroughly racked by guilt. That kind of shame cycle is a central part of addiction. You try to white-knuckle it and change things on your own accord. And when that fails, you fall into a spiral of punishment and self-hatred, which in turn leaves you defenseless for the next round. Rinse and repeat over and over again. Scott admits that his ability to stick to his guns and honor his boundaries was basically non-existent. And because of that, his self-contempt got so severe that he would find himself wishing a truck would veer off the road and slam into his truck. That seemed like the only lasting solution. Things were really coming to a head now. Rose was increasingly uncomfortable and distressed by the new year, and it was impossible to ignore the sinking suspicion that something was very, very wrong. It was even worse than she'd been fearing. She hated feeling suspicious. She didn't want to be that person, always jealous and vigilant, monitoring all her partner's activities. But she's also not stupid. And she knew that whatever was going on needed to be dragged into the light.
I had been feeling really suspicious and really uncomfortable. And I was in his office one day and I saw his old cell phone sitting on a shelf. And I picked it up and I turned it on and I went to his text messages to see what was there. And there were only a few messages from her. So things had been deleted. But one of the messages was a picture of him in front of our fireplace. And underneath it, he had put, "I wish you were here cuddling by this fire with me." And I chatted with my clinical supervisor about it because she's, "Hey, you seem stressed. What's going on?" So I chatted with her about it and she looked at me and she goes, "What would you tell a client who was going through what you're going through?" And I said, "I would say it sounds like your husband's having an affair and you need to sit down with your husband and talk and find out what's going on." And she says, "Yeah, it sounds like your husband's having an affair. And it may not be physical, but it's definitely emotional." I literally came home that night from talking to her and I was kind of fired up. I was kind of emboldened by the conversation. And I sat down with him and I was, "Look, you can't be friends with my ex-counselor anymore. I am uncomfortable. This is not working for me. I feel like you're having an emotional affair with her and I'm not okay with it. This has to stop."
Rose did not know at the time she confronted Scott he was high on ketamine. He listened as she aired her concerns, And then he just stared at her and said, "Jealousy is not a good look on you. But fine, I'll stop talking to her." He was oozing resentment, which was unlike him, and was maybe less about Rose and more about the shame and self-contempt he was mired in those days. But Rose was caught in the line of fire, and he essentially said she was the one with the problem. This kind of bitter defensiveness, it was uncharacteristic for him. And it was further confirmation for Rose that she was not just being paranoid. And she hadn't even mentioned yet that she had found his text message to Chrissy about wanting to cuddle. Eventually, Scott relented. "Fine," he said. If Rose was really that uncomfortable, maybe he could humor her. What she didn't realize was that Scott was already trying to cut Chrissy off. In fact, he'd confronted her that very morning.
The texting stopped. The calling stopped. What I didn't know was that my husband was already feeling incredibly guilty and incredibly eaten up by this. And so what he didn't tell me that night when I talked to him was that literally that morning, he had called her and tried to end things. So he had called her and said, "Stop saving that hour. I do not want to see you in the waiting room when I bring my daughter. We're not going to text anymore. We're not going to call anymore. I don't want to see you anymore. This has to stop. I can't keep doing this to my wife. I can't keep doing this to my family. This isn't okay." She then cried and sobbed and begged and told him that he was abandoning what his soul knew he needed, that they were obviously soulmates, that they had an intense, amazing connection, and that he couldn't just turn that away. He couldn't just turn that off, that he needed to live up to his potential and be with a partner who understood him on that deep soul level. And that if I was really a good wife who really loved him, I would only be happy for him that he had found more love in the world. And she's arguing with him. "I know all these people in polyamorous relationships. I've helped all these people get into polyamorous relationships. I'm dating this other guy who's dating 2 other people, and it's wonderful, and he's doing great, and he's realized his full potential just like you can." Well, it starts to come out that some of these people, as she's talking to him, are her former clients.
So not only was Chrissy having an affair with her client's husband, she was in an ongoing love triangle, or quadrilateral or something, with multiple other clients. She pulled out all of the stops, wielding her best manipulation tactics in an effort to keep Scott close. The tears, the pleading, the declarations of love, and musings about being soulmates. And of course, the blaming. She told Scott it was Rose's fault that they couldn't all just get along. If only Rose would learn to share, then we could all just be so happy together. Now remember, that's her former client that she is blaming and villainizing. When this story starts to feel too outrageous, too much like a soap opera, it's important to pause and remember that Chrissy was supposed to be Rose's therapist. To his credit, Scott told Chrissy flat out, he wasn't interested in polyamory. He didn't want to spend some nights with Chrissy and then other nights at home with his family. And even if that was what he wanted, he knew it couldn't work out without communication and honesty the whole time. And the 2 of them had been anything but. They had been lying to Rose from day one. Scott assured Rose he would stop talking with Chrissy. But Chrissy refused to go away that easily. Within a few days, she texted Rose and asked if they could meet for coffee. And Rose sat on that message for a few weeks before responding, "No, that doesn't seem like a good idea. I don't want to see you, and you don't feel safe to me anymore. You and my husband had an emotional affair, and I can't trust you anymore." Because at that point, that's still all she thought it was, an emotional affair. Which, quick side note, emotional affairs are still incredibly painful. She also told Chrissy she had genuinely cared for her, both as a therapist and as a friend. And she didn't want to hurt her. Let's just call it quits and go our separate ways. Meanwhile, Scott found it more difficult than he'd like to admit to cut things off and to enforce the boundaries that he had promised Rose. Boundaries like telling Chrissy, you can't wait around to meet me during my daughter's therapy sessions anymore. And you should probably find somewhere else to do your grocery shopping. And she needed to leave the yoga studio Scott and Rose had both attended.
Well, of course, she kept going to the yoga classes. And of course, every time that he brought my daughter for therapy, she was right there waiting. She was dragging him into her office. She was begging. What she would do is she would come out to the waiting room and say, just come in for a few minutes and let's catch up. And he would say, no, I'm not going in your office. I told you I wasn't going to go in your office. And she would get loud. She would start crying. She would raise her voice to the point that he was afraid our daughter would overhear her and he would agree to go into her office.
Rose says that in addition to being a flirt, her husband can be a bit of an idiot sometimes. And maybe he thought he had the situation more under control than he actually did. She's also acute enough to know that Scott really had deep and genuine feelings for Chrissy. He didn't want to hurt her, and he thought maybe he could offer her a few breadcrumbs. Maybe that would help wean them off of each other without actually hurting her too much.
I had told her we're done. And I left one small little cracked window open for her, which was this document that we would write in. Because she begged and she pleaded and she cried and she literally got on her knees and begged me for some way to communicate with me. And it was, look, you can write in this document. I may check it sometimes. I had told myself over and over again, I will never step in that office again. I will never touch her again. I will never kiss her again. I will never let her touch me again. I would set these boundaries for myself and express those boundaries to her. And then within 30 minutes of communicating, I would be walking over all those boundaries again. My wife knew absolutely that I was struggling with something. I think she thought it was the drugs. I certainly don't think she thought it was this. I had to tell my wife everything. I had to tell her everything that happened.
This is going on now. We're into February, March. His birthday's in March. She sets up an entire scavenger hunt for him for his birthday to go find a present that she got for him. And he doesn't go. She puts it in the document. He reads it, but he doesn't go because he's trying. He's really trying-ish to pull back at this point. And she's furious. She's crying. She's screaming. She's losing it at him. Again, he brings our daughter in and she's losing it in the waiting room. And she goes into her office to quiet her down. And she's trying to give him this pile of presents for his birthday. And I can't take these. How do you expect me to take these home? My wife will know we talked. And I'm getting super mad. I texted her and told her to leave you alone and leave me alone. I told her this. You told her this, supposedly, and I'm trusting him. Why is she still coming out to talk to you? Why is she still going to your yoga classes? What is happening here? So I'm starting to get this picture that she's really pursuing him. But at this point, I'm still trusting him that nothing physical has happened. Right? I'm not understanding how deep in it he is.
Rose was kind of pissed that he hadn't fully cut ties yet, but she also wanted to believe he was trying. She wanted to be able to trust him again, and besides, they couldn't control where Chrissy went to yoga, where she shopped for groceries, or how she moved around her office building. Maybe Scott could drop their daughter off and stay in the car, but Chrissy would probably just come out to the parking lot. Rose was just now getting a sense of how relentlessly Chrissy was pursuing Scott. She wanted to possess him, and she wasn't going to give up. Finally, after running out of ways to put it off, Scott started getting more honest with Rose. He remembers that they were out for sushi, and he just broke down and started sobbing in the middle of the restaurant. He told her that the affair had gotten physical, despite what he had told her before. And he started fessing up to how out of control his ketamine addiction had gotten as well. All of this knocked the wind out of Rose. She felt so foolish for not piecing together the clues, for not picking up on all of the signs. The two of them had gotten really good at hiding things from her, but she was still really hard on herself. I should have known better. I'm such a fool. Any of you who have suffered this kind of betrayal, I'm sure the internal dialogue sounds familiar. As part of his newfound transparency, Scott gave Rose access to the Google document that he shared with Chrissy. And Chrissy tried deleting a lot of it, but Google lets you restore previous versions. So Rose could read every word of what they'd written in there. Most of Scott's contributions were about how conflicted he felt, how he shouldn't have gone into her office again, and that they can't keep doing this. Chrissy, on the other hand, seemed to have treated the document as a strange combination of love letters and a personal journal.
One of the things I find in that document is the story of her telling my two supervisors that are her friends and my daughter's counselor about this relationship she's having with my husband. So she tells them that she's got this former client and she's become friends with that former client's husband and she loves him. She's in love with him. She doesn't disclose that she's having an affair with him. So she tells them that she's in this intense friendship and she's in love with this guy. But that's it. She doesn't quite go to the extent of telling them that it's been a physical relationship. And then she tells them who it is. And so they have this full meeting. What they told me, again, is that she didn't disclose the truth of the relationship, only that there was a friendship that I had agreed to. When I met with my two supervisors there, they told me that they couldn't meet with me for the next month because they needed to go talk to lawyers. They needed to research the ethical code. They weren't sure whether they could keep supervising me and whether they might also be obligated to file a complaint. And to be honest, part of me was, you were obligated the minute she told you anything, even if it was a friendship. I think they were terrified that I would report them too.
Her relationship with her supervisors kind of started to take on an arm's length feel, or like a cover your ass kind of feeling from their end. They'd tell her they weren't fully aware of what was going on, or they're out of town, or they need to do more research before they can meet with her again. It seems likely they were afraid of getting caught up in something so messy, afraid of taking any big steps, and probably worried that they could get reported. And in my opinion, rightfully so, for not having handled it better right from the beginning. This was true for others in the industry too. Rose was desperately trying to find a new therapist because of how devastating this all was. But whenever she sought out referrals, she felt everyone was treating her as if she was the threat.
So I did tell every person that I reached out to that I had lost my counselor because she had crossed boundaries and I had to file a report, that I had to file a complaint. So I do tell them that much. I'm not telling them the details, but I'm telling them that much. And I'm getting this kind of pushback. Oh yeah, no, I don't know anyone. Oh yeah, no, I can't help you. I feel that there is definitely a level of fear, right? Oh, you're a counselor who can report another counselor. You're dangerous. And honestly, at this point, I think I have some counselor trauma. Like I've got lists of counselors in front of me and I literally can't pick up the phone. How can I know if this is an okay person? And I'm recognizing this kind of paralysis, but I also know I really need a counselor. So I'm trying to just ask people, like, someone give me a name. Someone give me a name of someone you trust because I can't find someone off a list, right? So I'm begging both of my supervisors for recommendations. I'm reaching out to every good counselor that I know. Do you have a recommendation? Is there someone I can see, right? I can't see any of you guys. You're my supervisors or my friends, but I need someone. Please recommend me someone. And everyone's kind of like, no, I don't really know anyone. I'm not going to refer you to anyone I know because you're dangerous.
It was almost like Rose had broken some unspoken and sacred rule. Clinicians were expected to protect and defend one another, no matter what. Now Rose had shattered that trust, and they couldn't let her back in. Like a union worker crossing a picket line or a police officer going to internal affairs. Institutions so often foster this sort of internal, self-protective gatekeeping, and the mental health field is no different. Obviously, that mentality isn't inevitable across the board, and it isn't totally black and white. Rose's supervisors were able to help her in certain ways when they were finally ready to meet, but it always felt like there was a layer of fear between them now. Like everyone else was coordinating their moves together so they wouldn't misstep around Rose. Their interactions also felt careful and calculated. Part of this walking on eggshells approach is because the lines of what's officially ethical and what's not are often extremely blurry. It can vary wildly from one oversight body to another. There are obvious lines in the sand, of course, like, for example, pursuing an affair with your patient's husband, a firm no-go. But without any concrete evidence, outside observers can still be left with a whole lot of question marks.
The ACA, the American Counseling Association, says no. There can't be sexual contact with a client, former client's family member, current client's family member, or their romantic partners for at least 60 months after the therapeutic relationship ends. But it actually also says it still shouldn't happen, right? It's still prohibited. The ethical guidelines are not quite as comprehensive. And so what my state says is that sexual contact with a client or former client is prohibited, and that there can be no dual relationships with anyone who's with the client or with anyone who's connected to the client. And so that, and then they also have the ethical guideline of you can't do anything that would cause harm to your client or former client. And so within my state, those are the guidelines that cover this.
Given Chrissy's behavior, Rose was more than justified in filing a complaint with the ethics committee. But even after everything she had been through, even after all of the manipulation and mistreatment, she's still not sure exactly how the process will play out. She says the board has been pretty close-lipped.
I'm not allowed to go. They did not call my husband for a statement, but she's going to be there. She didn't know that we wouldn't be there. When she was on the phone, she was, oh, so all three of us are going to be there, I guess, and we'll see what happens. And I'm like, I don't get to be there. He doesn't get to be there. It's just her. The committee's already met and they've already got their recommendation ready. The board will just look at their recommendation and decide what to do about it. At least I can let her insurance know what she's doing. At least I can let the ACA know what she's doing, right? At least I can put this stuff out there. The hearing is in 3 weeks. I know she's going to be present, and I can jump into that a little bit. The reason I know that is because she actually reached out to my husband this week. She's supposed to have no contact with me or him, but she texted him at the beginning of this week. But what was interesting is that my husband and I had talked a little bit recently about him reaching out to her for a very specific reason. And the reason is that she was still going to his yoga classes, so he can't go and I can't go. And she's still going every single class that he went to, she's showing up at. The owner of the yoga studio is actually a friend of ours.
That's a pretty good indicator of just how raw and recent this all is. Some things have changed, like Scott's off of ketamine now, and he and Rose have started couples counseling. He also found a therapist for himself. But it's been an incredibly difficult few months for them both. Rose was having a hard time finding the support she needed, and Scott couldn't be there for her, not in the ways he'd like to, because of the profound rupture in trust. So a lot of this story is very much still in flux. In fact, the week of this conversation, they were waiting for the board hearing, and Scott had just received another text from Chrissy. She was also still shopping at the grocery store by their house several times a week. She didn't even like that grocery store, but she and Scott used to meet up there, and so she kept going. When Rose and Scott would do their grocery shopping, the cashiers would say, "Oh, hey, your friend was just here a little bit ago. You just missed her." Then there was the yoga studio. Scott had helped get that business off of the ground, and he'd been a regular there from day one. But now neither of them could go anymore, because it seemed like Chrissy went and made it her own. All that is why they were thinking of reaching out to Chrissy one more time, hoping they could try again to assert some boundaries. Because her presence in their life was like a thick fog. Even if she wasn't concretely there in front of them, she was obscuring everything else.
One of the ideas that I had about how to make things better was to call Chrissy. Under the supervision of my wife, fully recorded. Some of the things that we needed her to do was to stop going to my grocery store. I do all the grocery shopping, and she was showing up every day looking for me. She took over my yoga studio, so I haven't been able to go to yoga. These were things that were causing both of us great distress. I proposed, let me call her and request her to leave these spaces and let her know that I'm not looking for a chance encounter. I'm not looking to run into her. I'm not hoping we can kind of steal a moment together. I don't want that. She's caused me nothing but absolute torture, and none of it was worth it.
And so we talked, and I'm like, I can't go to the grocery store. Neither one of us can go to yoga. We're in this weird position. And he's, look, I don't want to talk to her and I don't want to see her. But I think if I asked her, if it came from me and I asked her to stop going to these places, I think she would. So I'll only do it if you're comfortable with it. I'll only do it if you're there. I do not want to do it behind your back, right? He's being very transparent. And we talked it out, and we talked it out with our couples counselor, and we decided maybe it was a good idea so that there could be some safety in going to these spaces that we go to regularly. So he literally is walking into the room to make this phone call when her text message comes through. Literally the exact moment.
Chrissy was texting to let Scott know that her father had passed away. She'd suffered a loss, and her instinct was still to reach out to him for comfort. It was quite a jolt, and the timing was eerie. But at least now the seal was broken. They'd been talking about needing a conversation with her, and Chrissy had just cracked open the door.
He messages her back and says, can we talk privately? Doesn't say, I'm sorry about your dad or anything like that. Just, can we talk? It's this very weird text message. She's like, well, what does that mean? And he says, a quick video call away from other people. And she says, okay. So the next day he tries to call her and she picks up, but she says, oh, I'm literally at the funeral home. I have to go in and meet my mom and brother. This is terrible timing. But the truth is, she's grinning. She's so excited to see him. She's so happy. Like, she's at the funeral home and she's just this huge, huge smile on her face. She's so excited. And he's, okay, well, we'll try again later then. She's like, wait, just talk to me for a minute. Tell me how you are. And he's, no, text me when you're done. And she goes, am I allowed to do that? And he says, no, but how else are we going to do this? Text me when you're done, right? So it's hours and hours and hours later that she texts, okay, I'm here. And a little while after that we kind of had privacy from the kids again. And so he calls her. She doesn't know I'm there. And he basically lays that out for her. Hey, I need you to stop going to these places. I need it. I'm not trying to run into you. And she goes, you're not? And he says, no, I'm terrified of running into you. I don't want to see you. He's sober now. He's looking back on his behavior very differently. And that sobriety was huge because he's literally sitting there going, I don't know how I made these decisions. It felt like me, but I can't imagine how I decided that was an okay thing to do.
We were able to obtain a copy of that phone recording, but for legal reasons, we're not able to share it on the show. I'll do my best to summarize it, but I don't think I can fully capture the staggering amount of disconnect in the conversation. Scott was being blunt and to the point, not really saying much at all. Even offering sympathy for her loss might have sent signals he did not want to send. But the only thing that seemed to register with Chrissy was, you're here. We're talking. This is so great. We can still make this work. She told him how the fallout of their relationship and the review process had all been hell for her. But it had also been one of the best months of her life. She was writing all of the time, and she was amazing at her job. Yes, she actually said, I'm amazing at my job. And she really liked the person that she was and all of the people in her life. All that's missing is you, she said. But at the same time, she said he wasn't really missing at all. He was always there, with her in spirit, present even when he wasn't literally there. She couldn't stop thinking about him, and she didn't want to because he was her spiritual husband.
Again, she's just so delighted to see him, asking him all about his life, and he's putting her off. He's trying to keep it on this subject. She finally starts to get this picture. I've watched the whole video call, and I'm watching her, and she's suddenly getting this look on her face, and she's, oh, so this isn't the same for you as it is for me. And he was like, no. And she's, I've been carrying you with me every single day. I've been desperate to talk to you. I've been so excited to see you. This is amazing. Look at you. You're beautiful. Look at how beautiful you are. You're so handsome. I'm so happy to see you. And he decides to let her talk a little bit, thinking she might incriminate herself. And she's, well, your wife has been texting me. And I've sent her probably 4 text messages over 4 months. The first one, which was, how could you? The second one, which was me going, okay, I'm ready to hear your side of the story. She didn't reply to that. But honestly, I didn't intend to be nasty. And so I kind of sent her a message that basically said, he wasn't your soulmate. It's been weeks and weeks and weeks. I cut him loose. I told him he could go. I told him he could go be with you. And he didn't. He's here. He's begging me to continue our marriage. He's working on it. He's doing every single thing I've asked him to do. He doesn't want to be with you. Please understand, you need to move on. And then one more that I sent her later, as more and more and more pieces of this story have come out in couples counseling and everything, going, you're a predator. You are a predator. And my complaint was totally valid. And so I wrote her a message and I called her a predator. And when she talked to my husband, she said, I can't believe your wife's calling me a predator. Wasn't everything we did consensual? I wasn't being predatory.
Rose's text was strongly worded enough for Chrissy to go back to the old blame game. She could tell Scott that Rose was just being so nasty. It was all her fault that they couldn't be together. If only Rose would grow up, they could all be happy. She also said that she hadn't done anything unethical. Sure, maybe it might have been immoral in the eyes of some, but definitely not unethical. She was even still updating the public Spotify playlist that she had made for Scott, full of sappy love songs and lyrics about how you've got a wife, but I don't care. But by this time, Scott was both sober enough and broken-hearted enough not to be swayed by those tactics. He ended the call having accomplished what he'd set out to do, and nothing more. And he says maybe it was worth it, maybe it was helpful, but it's hard to say for sure what the impact that call will have. Since so much of the story is still up in the air, at the very least, Rose and Scott feel safe going to the grocery store again. The yoga studio, however, is a different story.
So we end up having the phone call. I got a call a day later from the owner of the yoga studio, who's a good friend of mine, saying, hey, we need to get together and talk. And so we did. We sat down and talked. It turned out that Chrissy had sent an email or text message, I'm not sure, some communication to the owner of the studio and the instructor that she goes to regularly, basically telling the entire story or her side of it. I didn't see it. And saying that I've asked her to leave these spaces and she's fine with the grocery store, but she's not okay with the yoga studio. She's pissed. She's upset. She's invested a lot of time and energy in the studio. She's built great relationships there. And she's not okay with it. She hates that she has to leave the studio, but out of respect for me, she's going to leave the studio.
So the owner of the yoga studio took it upon herself to sit down with Scott and initiate some sort of mediation. Maybe you can have mornings and she can have evenings, or she takes Tuesdays, you take Thursdays, something like that. And maybe this seems like a small thing for some. Maybe it's tempting to be like, oh, boo-hoo, you have to find somewhere else to do yoga. But it's worth noting how cunning this bit of triangulation is. Chrissy knew the studio owner was friends with Scott and Rose, and she knew that it was an important, safe space for both of them, especially for Scott. As long as she's showing up there, it won't ever feel safe again. And even if Chrissy is barred from going there, Rose doesn't think she'll ever go back, in case she's secretly resented and blamed for pushing out another customer. The way Chrissy has manipulated and wedged herself into their lives, refusing to leave, it's actually quite infuriating. Recently, Rose's daughter had been hinting that she knows something is wrong in their family. So Rose sat down with her daughter's counselor, who also happens to be one of Rose's supervisors. And that counselor/supervisor, not to mention a colleague of Chrissy, told Rose that she believes Chrissy might have a personality disorder. She said it seems like Chrissy was literally trying to take over Rose's life. That was when Rose learned about the "he's my soulmate" text from the first time Chrissy met Scott. And now, well, here's where I should apologize and acknowledge that the ending of this episode is not going to be very satisfying. Because there really isn't an ending. Just within the last couple weeks, after we've recorded these interviews, Rose found out that the decision of the ethics board was to push back the meeting until next December. For now, though, I want to thank Rose so much for sharing her story with us. Unless you've been in a similar situation, it's impossible to realize how much courage this takes. And I should thank Scott, too. For someone who's admitted to how much he likes to play the hero, he has been admirably transparent here about the moments in which he was anything but heroic. And that takes courage, too. We will definitely be keeping in touch with Scott and Rose and looking forward to the next update. But until then, I wish both of them all of the best as they keep navigating this story and as they keep working toward a way to move forward together. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you or someone you know has a story of therapy harm that they would like to share, they can reach out to me directly at podcast.pyschotherapy@gmail.com. I'd like to give a special thanks to our writer, Bo Denton, for all of his hard work, and to the talented audio engineers at Peachtree Sound for their expertise. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will join us next time.